Good morning, everybody. I guess we will go ahead and get started, and we may have some more people joining us as we go along. I'm Allison Taylor, and my husband Tom and I have a company called Pictures and Stories, and what we do is we help people create life story books and video projects, and we help people find ways to preserve their stories and share them with their loved ones. And we love our jobs. We just feel like we have the best jobs in the world, and we love being able to get people excited about the idea of telling their stories. Tom is out at a meeting today, so I'm going to be flying solo. And what we're going to be talking about today is how we can choose what stories to tell about our lives. Our lives are complicated. There's a lot of things that have happened to us, and sometimes it can get really overwhelming thinking about which stories are the most important to tell, and what do I really want to get across to the people who might be interested in reading my stories or listening to them. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And one of the most important things about learning how to choose what stories to tell is to figure out what a story is in the first place. And we try to get people to think in the context of story as opposed to getting across facts and figures and dates and events or anecdotes, but to think of what is the larger story, what is the more interesting story, the more important story that you're trying to tell. Because we all think in stories. We live in story. Everything that we do has to do with relating to other people through the stories that they tell. How we present ourselves to others is in part due to what stories we tell about ourselves and how we tell them. So understanding kind of what a story is important for that. What I've got up on the screen here is a little story diagram that I thought was quite charming. And this is a story diagram that this gentleman wrote about writing novels. And it's very complicated and it kind of goes through the whole process of telling a story. We're not going to get anywhere near that complicated. What we're going to do today is talk to you about just some simple elements in story and how to get your mind into thinking about what a story is and getting into that story mindset as you're choosing your story, so it will help you decide what things you want to include. Some of the basic elements of a story are, first of all, the setting of the story. Where does this story take place? When did it take place? What are some of the background details? The characters are the people in your story, and usually in an autobiography or when you're writing your own life story, you are the protagonist of your story or the main character, but that's not always true. And you can tell a story about your own life in an interesting way where you may not be the protagonist of the story. It may be that you're telling someone else's story and how it relates to your own story. But any of the people in your story, even animals can be, pets and so forth, can be characters in your story. A general theme. What is the story about? What is the point of that story? The plot is the sequence of events in a story. And just because a story has a plot doesn't mean that it has to be long or complicated. You can have a story that's just a paragraph long, and it will still have a story arc. It'll have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a sequence of events. And I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. Another thing that a good story almost always has, as opposed to just an anecdote or a report, is a conflict of some sort. The character in the story has to overcome some sort of problem or struggle, or either they overcome it or they may not overcome it. But that struggle or the problem that they need to overcome is what creates the drama in the story, and it's what makes the story interesting for the reader to read, and also it makes the story much more meaningful. For example, in the story of Tom Sawyer, a story doesn't have to be complicated or this big tragic epic story in order to have a conflict. Even the most simple humorous story, if it's a good story, will have some struggle in it. And Tom Sawyer's struggle is that he doesn't want to paint the fence. So he has to find a way to get other people to do the work for him that he doesn't want to do. So it doesn't have to be a big, complicated, epic deal. It can be just a very simple event, simple story with a simple struggle that someone has to get over in order to create the drama in the story. Let's talk for a moment about the difference between a story and a report. A report conveys information, conveys data of some kind, but it doesn't necessarily make a story. And this is a great example that I found off of the FamilySearch.org website in some of their training materials. And I just thought it was the perfect example of showing how you can take just data, genealogical data, a name, a date, a birthplace, and really make it into a story, flesh it out, and make it something that's actually interesting for someone to read. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read this off of the screen just in case someone is not having, being able to look at the screen here. But so the report would be, I, Lindsay Mary Adams, was born on March 31st, 1951 in London, England. So that has all the genealogical data is there. We know her name, we know when she was born, and we know where she was born. Okay, it's all information that's important to have in this person's life story. However, if you can wrap those details into a story that's interesting to read, it'll be remembered much more easily, and it will be much more entertaining for the reader to read. So here's the story that this person was able to weave these details into. My mother really didn't want me to be born on April Fool's Day, so she convinced her doctor to induce her labor on the morning of March 31st. Things have changed a lot since 1951, but in those days it was almost unheard of in London, England, for a birth to be induced for the mother's convenience. The young Scottish doctor was willing to be innovative, and I was born 3 hours before April Fool's Day. The doctor was given the privilege of choosing my name, possibly as part of the inducement deal, and I was given the good Scottish name of Lindsay Mary to go along with my family name, Adams. So you can see that this story, even though it's only a paragraph long, it has all of the elements of an entertaining story, and it includes the genealogical data, which is important. So we have the setting in a hospital in London. It's 1951. The characters, the mother, the doctor, and the main character of the story is the unborn baby. So that's a little different way of, she's basically telling her mother's story, but this story not her own. It has a very simple beginning, middle, and end, and it has a conflict. The mother does not want her daughter to be born on April Fool's Day, so she's got to find a way to solve this problem, and that is where the kernel of the story is. And the overall theme is that mom got what she wanted, and that could be a good setting up of the mother's character for the rest of the stories that this person is going to tell in this history, because it really says something about the character of her mother. So in one simple paragraph, you've told an entertaining story that also has the important information. Okay, let's talk a little bit about story versus an anecdote. An anecdote is where you're all sitting around with your friends at dinner and you're trading stories about your most embarrassing moment, for instance. And I say, oh, I've got you all beat because when I was in junior high school, I was in a play, and in front of the entire junior high, in a performance of this play, my skirt fell off and I was standing on the stage in my underwear in front of the entire junior high. Okay. This is a true story out of my life, unfortunately. But this is an anecdote that I've told over and over throughout my life because it's just a funny little story, and it always, gets a laugh. But it wasn't until I started writing about this particular incident as I was writing some stories about that period of my life, that I realized how much more there was to this story. And I didn't even really realize it until I started actually writing it down and fleshing out these some ideas about this story and looking at elements on my timeline. So when I really dove into this and started thinking about it more and started looking at some of the other elements, other things that were going on in my life at the time, I realized that there was a much more important story there. So the story behind this is that I ended up, I got the lead in the school play, and it was The Miracle Worker, which is about Helen Keller and her teacher, Anne Sullivan. And I was playing Anne Sullivan. This is not me in the picture. I don't have a picture of me in this play. So we're doing a performance of this play for the assembly, the school assembly, in front of my entire junior high school. And we're in the middle of this scene, and if any of you have seen the play or seen the movie, there's a scene where there's this epic battle that takes place between Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller when she's trying to get her to use a fork and a napkin and use some table manners. And they end up in this big actual physical fight. And we're doing this fight scene, and I stand up, and suddenly the safety pin or something on my skirt gives way, and my skirt is hanging down around my ankles, and I'm standing there on the stage in my underwear, which was no doubt very embarrassing. Of course, the whole audience just bursts out into laughter and catcalls. The girl playing Helen Keller starts giggling. She's not supposed to be able to see me even. But so I'm standing there in abject humiliation on this stage with my skirt down around my ankles, and the entire junior high is laughing. And I realized you have these moments in life where time just stops. and I suddenly had this moment of clarity. I mean, my first instinct was, of course, to just like burst into tears and run off the stage. And yet something happened to me. The backstory to this is that some of these kids in that audience had been bullying me for years. They had been, threatening me, following me home after school and throwing things at me. That, typical kind of junior high bullying. They never hurt me, but it was just always a source of stress. And I've been going through this for a while. And as I stood there on this stage, I just suddenly, all of this rage came up out of me. And I just, like something snapped inside of me, and I just said, I am not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. And so from some reserve inside of me, I was able to pick up my skirt, held onto it with one hand while I continued this scene, and I took Helen Keller, threw her down on the ground, finished the lines of the play, and I put all of my emotion and all of my humiliation and anger into the scenes of that play, and suddenly the audience got completely quiet. And I finished the play. We all got, thunderous applause at the curtain call. And then the next day, I was walking down the hall, and this kid that I didn't even know came up to me and said, oh, yeah, you were really good in the play. And then somebody else came up to me and said, yeah, you were really good in the play. And what happened is that suddenly I felt like, yeah, I was good. I had a talent. This is something that I could do and that I could do well. And the point to this is that no one at that school ever bullied me again after that. So that was the crux of this story. And what I had been telling as just a funny anecdote my whole life, suddenly realized how important and what a turning point that story was in my life. And I don't mean to make this whole webinar about me and this story of my life, but I wanted to use it as an example to show you how to take a simple episode of your own life and dig deeper to find what the meaning is. Is there a deeper meaning? Was it something that was important? Was it a turning point in your life? And looking for, being aware as you're choosing your stories, looking for those turning points. And I didn't even realize that this was a turning point, but it really was, because I gained a skill. It was something that, it was a moment for me where I was able to triumph over these people who were being mean to me and triumph over my own fear. And I ended up doing a lot of theater in the years following that, and it was a really good experience for me. So this turned out to be a very important experience in my life. So that's the reason that I tell this story, is because I want to show you how I got to this process of finding the kernel of the more important kernel of the story. And I'll show you in a little bit how I was able to, kind of what my thought process was that made me think of that. Okay, so how do we choose, out of all of these things that are rolling around in our brains and all of these possible story ideas, how do we actually choose what stories to tell? And I know that those of you who have the How to Save Your Life One Chapter at a Time book and kit that Tom and I have developed, we've structured these webinars to go along with that book. A couple of weeks ago we talked about life timeline and how to capture your story ideas and capture memories. And so if you have that kit and if you've been following along, or if you've just been following along with these webinars, you probably have started working on a timeline. So we'll go over that in just a minute. But the first thing that you want to, the starting point for you in choosing your stories is to think about your purpose for writing your life story, your audience, who's going to be reading the story, and the scope of your story. What time period, what theme are you dealing with in this particular story? And for those of you who have the kit, that we have cards that are in there on which you can write your purpose, your audience, and scope. But if you haven't done that already, you want to really spend a little bit of time thinking about, why are you writing this story? What is the purpose? Are you just trying to get people to know you? Are you do you want to inspire the people who are going to read the book? Are you trying to entertain them? Are you writing a funny or a comedic or humorous part of your life? And who is your audience? Who is going to be reading this book? Are you writing this mostly for your children? Are you writing it for a wider audience? Are you going to try to, sell it to a general audience? And any of those things are absolutely valuable. You can even just write it for yourself. There are so many helpful ways, or so many helpful things that can happen to you when you write stories about yourself. And the things that you will learn about yourself and about your life and the people in your life will just astound you once you get into this writing exercise. So writing a story just even for yourself is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but you just want to be able to understand who your audience is for you and what your purpose is for you. It doesn't matter what anyone else's purpose or audience might be for their life stories. And the scope is what and when your story takes place, or does it have a particular theme? Your scope can be, you might want to just do a book about your childhood, or about your experiences in the war, or about your struggle with illness. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole comprehensive chronological account of your life. You can, and we recommend this to a lot of people, to just maybe choose a smaller section of your life and write about that, and even make a book about that, and maybe do a series of smaller books or chapter books about your life rather than trying to put it all in one big volume. Okay, so here is where we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but if you weren't with us at the time, we talk about capturing your story ideas on a timeline of some sort, and we have timelines in the kit that you can use to capture your story ideas on, or you can just use a notebook. You can use a an Excel spreadsheet if you want, whatever way works for you. But you need to have one place to capture all of these story ideas, all of these memories that come randomly, and they do come randomly. Once you start this process of capturing your story ideas, and you will be surprised. I mean, you'll be washing the dishes and something will trigger a memory, or you'll be driving somewhere, or just at the most random moments and in random order, these things will come to you. And you want to be able to capture them because 5 minutes later, you may not remember that again. So a timeline, whether it's an actual chronological timeline by year, by decade, you can just kind of decide what divisions you want to make of your life. I divided mine up into segments kind of based on where I lived at the time, because that's an easy way for me to remember things. And then I kind of figure out, well, what years did we live in this particular house? But that's where, I'm a very visual person, so all of my memories, my visual memories, have to do with the place that I was living in at the time. And so that's one way to sort of help me divide my life into segments. And then I have that segment that I can just capture that memory, just write down a couple of just a few words about that particular instance, only enough to remind myself later of what that is. You don't have to write the story on your timeline. You're not going to be writing whole paragraphs of information, but just a few words to remind you not to forget that that event, that detail, anything like that. And I'll show you in a little bit some ways that you can see how things relate to each other on the timeline and maybe take different elements and combine them into a single story. So whether you do it on a timeline sheet or whether you're using a notebook or something like that, you just want to have that one place where you can capture all these ideas and just start brainstorming. And having a large brainstorming session is a great idea, and we strongly encourage our clients, when you're starting this, when you first create a timeline or a notebook or whatever you're using, that you sit down for about an hour and just have a brainstorming session and just write your dates or your life divisions on the top, and just start writing down anything that comes into your mind as fast as you can. And do that for about an hour. And that will sort of jumpstart the process in your head and get those ideas flowing. And they will continue to flow, and they will continue to come to you in the coming days and weeks. So that's why it's so valuable to have this place where you can capture all of these ideas. When you're in this stage of the process, don't try to edit yourself. You don't want to say, oh, well, that would make a stupid story, or no, I don't think that's that important. If it comes to your head, just jot it down. You can always decide later that you aren't going to include that. But so don't even worry about trying to decide what's going to make a good story or what isn't at this brainstorming point. You just want to get this stuff down. And don't have to worry about starting at your birth and trying to get your memories to come in chronological order, because they don't. They will come to you completely randomly. So that's why you want to have a timeline on which to capture them. Okay, and then once you've got, after doing this for a while, and it could be just a few days, it could be over a period of months if you're taking your time in doing this, and things will continue to come to you, and you can continue to add to this even while you're in the process of writing your stories later on, and especially when you're going through all your pictures, because your pictures will trigger more memories. But once you feel like you've got a timeline that has a whole bunch of stuff on it, and you've got a pretty good start to having a wealth of material from which to draw to tell your stories. This is when you want to sit down and you can start going through what we call this triage process. You can start looking at things on your timeline and saying, okay, what are the most important things that I want to tell in this particular project? Okay, and the question that we always suggest that people ask themselves, and this is what I've done with my own stories and my own timeline as well, is what can't be left out? You start with the most important things first, not necessarily the things that are chronological. You don't necessarily have to start with your birth or start with your early life. Just start with what's the most important. And as you go through this process, just one at a time, it will help you define what are the most important things that you want to get across in your story. So there are questions that you can ask yourself as you're going along as to why would I want to include this story. Is this a story, or is this a part of a story that I want to maybe include in my life story project. And the first question I always have people ask is, in fact, I taught a class several years ago where we met every week, and we actually used the class time to actually write. It wasn't just instruction, it was actual writing time. And so the very first thing that I had my students do was to get out a sheet of paper and say, okay, tomorrow you're going to be hit by a bus, and this is your one chance to tell other people that might be reading this what they should know about you and about your life. And so this is a great exercise because it really sort of gets you focused in on, what's the most important thing? What would I want people to know about me? And this could be a statement more than a story. It could be just an explanation of your philosophy, of things that you've learned, of how you feel about life, how you feel about yourself and your family. Anything that you feel is really important for people to know. And you don't necessarily have to include this in your life story, although I think it can be a really good idea. But it helps to sort of focus in on what's most important about your life, and it may help you to choose and focus in on what other things you might want to choose and include. Okay, the next question to ask is, does this particular story or story nugget, does it fit my stated purpose, audience, and scope? And you can see on your screen, these are the cards that come with the How to Save Your Life kit. But you can also, if you don't have the kit, you can just write this down. But I would really strongly encourage you to write this down. Once you determine what your purpose is, who your audience is, and what the scope is of this particular project, write it down. It doesn't mean that you can't change it later on as you go along. Sometimes you can start collecting stories and then you end up in a totally different trajectory, and you realize that you started out writing this comprehensive thing and maybe I just want to focus in on this. I mean, there are any number of things that can happen as you're in this process, and you're free to change your mind anytime you want. But at the beginning, if you at least start out with a goal, then you have a place to go, and that trajectory may change, and that's okay, but at least you have a starting point and you have a path that you can start to follow, and this will help you a great deal if you write this down. Another question to ask is, does this story have a point? Why is this story important enough to include? And it could be that it's just, it could be just that it's really entertaining. Rick typed a message to me asking, does a story have to have a conflict? And generally, I always say yes. I used the example earlier about Tom Sawyer, that even though, I mean, it's a funny story, it's a humorous story, but there's still a struggle in that story. And his struggle is that he just didn't want to paint the fence. Okay, he had to find someone else to do that for him. Again, the story earlier of the mother in the hospital. Her struggle was that, or her conflict was that she didn't want to have her baby be born on April Fool's Day, so she had to find a way around that. So even if it's something really simple, I think that that's the crux of what makes a story, and as opposed to a report or an anecdote. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't include reports and anecdotes in your life stories. And a lot of us have things that are just kind of memories that will create a visual picture in the reader's mind. And they may not have a conflict per se, but if there is one that if you can get to the heart of that, that will make your stories more interesting. But sometimes you have information that, or just details and facts that you want to get across that are important to include. But if you can find a way to weave them into a story or weave them into a larger message, then do that, because it will make your writing much more interesting. Another thing you can do is you can ask your audience, what do they want to know about you? I was doing I was talking to my daughter, that's my daughter Caitlin on the left, and talking to her about, what are you curious about? I've talked to her a lot about my life and my childhood and so forth, but sometimes I think we assume that our loved ones know a lot more about our past and our lives than they actually do. even if we told them before, maybe they didn't remember it, or so. So that's always, if you're writing a book for your children, for your grandchildren, really think about what would they want to know about you, what would be interesting to them. So I ended up doing just a short little book about some of my grade school experiences, and that's me on the right in the early 70s, wearing this real early 70s kind of outfit, sitting in a 70s chair. And I know my daughter would be really interested in that kind of, she's kind of fascinated with that whole time period. And so just even some of the details about what it was like to live in the 60s and 70s, what it was like to grow up then, it is interesting to her. So I included a lot of that in the story that I wrote of my childhood because I knew that would be interesting to her. So you can always ask them. There may be, part of your audience may be a future audience that hasn't been born yet. And obviously you can't ask them what they want to know. But you can ask yourself, what do I wish that I knew about my ancestors, about the people that came before me? I would give anything to know more about my great-great-grandfather and what he was like and how he lived. But he didn't write anything down, and nobody wrote anything about him. And so I feel that void, and I miss that. I would like to know those things about him. So you can think about that and think, what would someone in the future want to know about my life based on what would I want to know about those people that came before me? This picture, I love this photograph. This is actually my great-great-uncle, who I obviously never met, and he and his brother owned a general store in Ohio. And I have this picture that's been handed down through the family, and he's sitting in front of the store with a rooster on his leg. I would love to know what was up with that. Did he have a pet rooster? Was this Sunday dinner? Was the rooster just wandering by and hopped up on his knee? What are they looking at? They both look like they're looking at the same thing in the same direction. So it raises all this mystery, which is a great thing. Mystery is also a great way to get a reader engaged in the story, to ask questions. And if there are things that you don't understand about your life, that's okay too. Ambiguity can be a very interesting way to tell a story. So these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself. What stories to leave out? This is just the topic of how to handle family skeletons, how to handle difficult stories, divorce, death, illness, all the adversity that we have to deal with. It can be very, very tricky, fine line to walk to think about, how do I tell those stories? Should I tell those stories? And I think in future we will probably devote a whole webinar to that topic, because that's something that a lot of people, it's one of the biggest questions that we get with our clients, and something that people really struggle with is how do I tell the difficult things in my life? You don't want to leave them out altogether necessarily, because that's that's how people are going to learn from your story, is how you handle these things. However, so we're not going to go into detail about that today, because I think that deserves a much longer discussion. But I just wanted to touch on it a little bit today, to look at maybe the other side of it, and what are some things that you should maybe leave out, and what are some things to think about. So first of all, you may have some great story ideas on your timeline, but they don't necessarily fit your purpose and your audience and your scope for this particular project. If you're working on a storybook right now of a particular time of your life, when I was making my little childhood storybook, I had some other really terrific stories that happened a little bit later in my life, and I was wrestling with, okay, do I go that far in the time period, and I finally decided, no, I'm just going to stick with about this time that I was in elementary school. And then I can put these other great stories aside for a future project. So you might have some really good material, but you can maybe set it aside if it doesn't fit your particular purpose or your scope for this particular project, and use it later. Stories that aren't yours to tell. You might want to be careful about telling stories about other people, especially if it's not directly related to you. We did a book for a client who's just a terrific guy, and very, very funny. He was just a funny writer, had a great sense of humor, and one of his favorite things, and he told quite a few stories of just funny things that he had observed his neighbors doing, or funny things that had happened to his neighbors. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but you want to make sure, but we had to sort of gently say, okay, are you sure? Would this person be embarrassed if they read this? And at the very least, you want to change the name of the person if it's something that you feel like it might be embarrassing. But even, ask yourself, is this really my story to tell? And is this important for my life to tell my story? And it may be if it's somebody that was integral in your life. But it's just a question to ask and something to be aware of. And anything that is your story, might it hurt someone else or violate their privacy, or could you end up getting sued? These are all very difficult questions to ask. Generally, and we'll talk about this more next week when we talk about actually writing the stories, but generally I feel that when you are dealing with these sort of really difficult things in your life, the difficult stories, that go ahead and write whatever you need to write in the first draft. Because that first draft is just for you and no one else has to read it. And if it helps you to be able to get all that stuff out, and it will help you get things straight in your mind, and it will help you go through that process and deal with those things. You can always take it out later. So if there's something that you feel like, yeah, I think I'm going to write a story about this, and it's a difficult thing, go ahead and include that and start thinking about writing it. Take some notes on it, because you can always abandon it later, or you can always change it, tone it down. But go ahead and write it in the first draft for yourself and just get it out there if you need to. The other thing is that you want to examine your motivations. You want to make sure that, what are your reasons for wanting to tell this story, especially if it's a sensitive story, or it might be sensitive to family members or other people. Are you feeling like you kind of want to get back at that person, or do you feel like, this is a story that needs to be told even though it's a difficult story, so that people can understand something about your family, or can be edified by learning how you dealt with this situation? So you want to really look honestly at your motivations for tackling that particular subject and understand what your reason is, and make sure that you're not just complaining or trying to settle a score or any of those things. And the last thing I would mention right now is just to make sure that that it's your version of the story that you're telling, and don't let someone else dictate what that will be or what that should be. If somebody else, we see this a lot with our clients who they've written a story, and then somebody in their family will read the draft and they say, well, that's not the way it happened, that's totally wrong. But it doesn't really matter, because it's yours. This is your story, and it's your remembrances, and it's your viewpoint. And if someone has an issue with that, they can write their own story and write about their viewpoint and about their opinions about it. But this is your story, and it doesn't mean that you can't, if somebody points out to you that something is factually wrong, that you can't go in and change that. But just make sure that you are actually telling the story that you need to tell, and don't let anyone intimidate that out of you. Because this is your story, and it's important that you include what you have to say. One particular metaphor that my husband likes to use a lot, his father was an airline pilot, and Tom was also an airline pilot, but his father used to build airplanes in their garage. And apparently, and I don't know anything about flying, but apparently there's a law of aerodynamics that says that an airplane won't fly unless it has more lift than drag. And I thought that was a perfect metaphor for telling a story. Even though you don't want to shy away from the difficult things of your life, because that can be really important for someone else. You never know, but that 3 generations from now, somebody might read a story about your hardship and how you dealt with that situation, and it might give them hope, and it might give them strength in the future. I know I came across a story of my 5th great grandmother, and something that happened to her, over 200 years ago. And it really helped me through a tough time in my life. So you just don't know how something that you write today is going to help someone far in the future that you don't even know, or might help a stranger in the present day, and someone that you don't know that might happen to read your story. So you don't want to leave those things out altogether. You don't want to give your life a whitewash, but you want to make sure that there's a point and a purpose, and I would even maybe say a positive purpose behind what it is that you're writing. I think sometimes certain things just are best left unsaid. But if there's something uplifting that can come out of you talking about the difficult parts of your life, or something that shows your courage or something like that, then go ahead and include that. But just be careful of how it's presented. Okay. The next step after you have your timeline and you've circled all these things that you want to make into that you want to start fleshing out in stories. The next step is to make story notes. You're going to take one of those things, or maybe a couple of them might be combined, that are circled on your timeline, and you're going to get a card or a piece of paper. We have cards in the kit that for this purpose, but you can just use, pieces of paper or index cards or in a notebook, and just start writing down, first of all, what's the point of the story, what you think the point of the story is at the top. And if you don't know that yet, that's okay. Just go ahead and start writing notes about it, and that point might become evident to you as you're going through the process. But just start writing down everything you can remember about the story, whatever details you remember, how you felt about things, how other people felt about it, just anything that you can remember. Just go ahead and jot down just in notes. You're not trying to write the story yet. Just write as many things as possible as you can remember about that particular incident. And pretty soon you'll have a stack of these cards of all of these stories that you've chosen off of your timeline to tell. And this stack of cards or stack of papers is what you are going to use as your basis to start writing your stories. This is a very valuable exercise, and it helps so much. It's much easier to do it this way than to just start picking things off of your timeline or starting with your birth and trying to write it in order from there. This is a great way to do this. So as you're fleshing out your notes on these story cards or your sheets of paper, these are the questions that you ask yourself. What is the point of this story? Okay, is it entertaining? And sometimes that's enough. That's a good enough reason to tell a story. My dad tells this hilarious story about how he married my mother. It's actually quite a funny story, and I love when he tells that story because it's just hilarious. And so, there's no real deep meaning, but he did have a struggle in that story, so I'll just throw that in there. And it was the convoluted ways that he had to go through to try to solve his problem is what makes the story so funny. So keep that in mind. Does it reveal a character, either your own or someone else's? Does it teach a lesson? What did you learn about that situation? Did it change you in some way? And the point of the story can be self-evident. You don't have to write in the story itself. And the point of the story is, because usually if your story is written well, or just even written clearly, that point will become evident. Just a couple quick things to make your stories more interesting. One is to be specific, and this gets to more when you're actually writing the story, which we'll talk about more next week. But rather than just saying, okay, my dad was really frugal, you can give details and give the reader a visual picture of what that looked like. Okay, my father was very frugal versus my father kept every rubber band that came into the house in an old coffee can. He washed and reused aluminum foil, each square carefully folded and tucked away in this special aluminum foil drawer. Okay, so you're building a visual picture for this person. So even as you're just capturing little details on your story cards, keep those little details in mind because they can give the reader a visual picture. Be careful about what kind of detail you include. If you're describing your childhood house, for instance, you may want to talk about, maybe there was a special window that you used to pretend was Juliet's balcony, or, we had a fort that we built in the backyard under some trees, and these are the games that we used to play there, and we used to imagine that we were, spies, and make sure that you're not just talking about, well, we bought this house in 1952 and it was $5,600, and you want to make sure that you're giving more than just the facts. Although if the facts are important, you can certainly include them and weave them into the detail. But also look for the emotional detail as well. See, is there some sort of intrigue in the story? The more you can build that intrigue, the more you can build a sense of suspense, even in a simple or a humorous story, as to what happens next. You know, what's she going to do now that she's standing there with the skirt around her ankles? That will make it more interesting to the reader. Find the emotional core. Find the movement of the story. Is there some where the character in the story starts at one place and ends up in another place? In my little story, I started with being humiliated, but I ended up triumphing over this situation. Look for elements on your timeline or things that you have circled that that you can connect to combine into a story. When I was writing my my little anecdote about the play, I realized that my experience in the school play and this whole other element of my being bullied in junior high, that those are connected and really part of the same story. And so I didn't really realize that at the time until I was able to see that connection and then start writing the story that way. You might have a lot of just factual details and data on your timeline that needs to be included because it's important, but see if you can combine it into another story that you're trying to tell. The last thing I want to leave you with is just know that to be a person is to have a story to tell, and you are an interesting person and you do have a story to tell, and it's important that you tell it. Next week we are going to talk about how to actually write your stories. Once you have fleshed out your stories into the story note cards, what to do from that point on. And I am going to attempt to unmute the mics at this point and open it up for any questions. If you, we'll see how that goes. Sometimes that's caused some audio problems. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in your chat window or, okay, I have unmuted all the mics now, so, and I'm not hearing any really strange noises, so that's a good sign. Sometimes if people have, TVs on in the background or something, it can be really distracting or echoey. But right now it looks like the audio still sounds good. So if any of you have a question or something you want to discuss and just want to speak up, go right ahead. We've got, I think, about maybe 12, 13 more minutes. Let's see if anyone has anything that they want to bring up. Okay, pardon the silence here. I'm reading messages as they come in. One thing I will just mention is that we are recording these webinars, and we will be posting them on the How to Save Your Life membership. So if you have purchased the kit and you have access to the membership website, you will be able to see these webinars and view them again. At that point, at this point right now, that's the only place where we will be putting up those webinars to view. Okay, somebody's telling me the audio feedback is bad. I'm going to go ahead and unmute the microphones again. And all right, so hopefully that solved the audio issues. And so if you have a question, go ahead and just type it rather than trying to speak it, because if you say something, I won't be able to hear you, but at least that'll stop the echo. But as I was saying, we don't at this point have plans to publish the recorded webinars anywhere else at this point. We're looking at that and maybe some way to do that in the future, or maybe have a link somewhere in a blog post. So we will keep you posted on that. Okay, I have muted all of the speakers. Are you still hearing? Is the audio still sound bad? Okay, he says it's good now. All right, if anybody has a question, or if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and just say, I have a question, and then I will unmute your mic, or you can just type the question to me. Okay. All right, good. Sounds like our sound is good again. Okay. Okay, so just to reiterate, we will be recording these webinars and posting them to the How to Save Your Life membership website, which you will be able to access if you have purchased a kit. If you haven't purchased the How to Save Your Life kit, and if you're interested in that and you don't have it, you can actually email me at, in fact, I will put the website up here. You can either go to our picturesandstories.com website or the howtosaveyourlifeinabook.com website. And if you're interested in purchasing the kit, go ahead and shoot me an email at allison@picturesandstories.com. It's up on your screen right now, and I would be happy to give you the super duper discount code, and you can get it for $99 right now, which is less than half of the retail price. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and email me or go to the website, and I'd be happy to give you the discount code for that. In the future, we may be putting the recorded webinars up online somewhere else outside of the membership website. Okay, Joan asks a question. Do you find people read your story more if it is in 12 small volumes rather than the large block books? I would say that answer, okay, she says 3 books. I would say generally, possibly yes. It sort of depends, but it's something that doing smaller volumes of your life is a way that, first of all, it does make it easier for your reader to digest, and thereby possibly making it more likely to actually get read. And that doesn't mean that if you put your whole life in a whole big book that nobody's going to read it. They will read it, especially if it's well written, and if you have interesting stories to tell, and if you have a lot of pictures, which we strongly encourage people to add visual material to their books. But generally, we're finding that we try to encourage people to tackle books on a smaller in smaller volumes, partly because it makes it easier on you as the writer and creator of these books. There's something that happens when you focus in on one particular part of your life and just focus on that and get that done and then actually publish that book. It gives you this amazing sense of accomplishment that, like, oh, okay, I could do that, and it really didn't take me that long. And then you can then move on to another one. And it's nice for gifting too, because you can maybe give, one Christmas you can give everybody the book about your childhood, and then the next Christmas you can give them a book about your mission. And especially if you kind of make them all the same size and they have some design elements in common, they'll make a nice little set for your loved ones. Bill says, it might be easier to add an update some years from now if you have done your life story in segments. That is an excellent point. And we have done this for a few people that maybe somebody who's now in their 80s and they wrote a rather comprehensive book about their life when they were 60, and they've had 20 years of life, since then, and there are a lot of new stories to tell. And so definitely we would encourage doing an update or a chapter 2, volume 2 of your life if you've already done a life story earlier in your life. Certainly think of doing another shorter volume to supplement that. It's a great idea, and that's another advantage to telling your story in sort of chapters and doing a series of chapter books, is that you can do, you can even do a yearly highlights or a highlight, a book every decade, and these are the highlights of the things that have happened to our family in the last decade. So there are any number of ways that you can do that. Okay, we got about 5 or 6 more minutes. Any other questions that anybody has? Any difficulty that you've run across in trying to go through this process? We are definitely, I want to do another segment at some point or another future webinar on talking about how to handle the difficult and sensitive stories in your life, because I think that's probably something that that some of our clients had struggled with the most, and it seems to be a question that everybody has. I guess one other thought, until I get any other questions, one other thought that I'll leave you with is that one thing that we hear from people as we talk to, and we're sort of preaching in essence about the importance of saving your stories and sharing them and preserving them for the future. And one thing that we hear a lot, and it always makes me a little bit sad, is people say, oh, well, I'm not interesting. Nobody's going to want to, nobody cares about my story. And people feel like because they may not be a successful, wealthy pillar of the community, or because they haven't invented something really amazing, or they haven't accomplished these big noteworthy things, that that somehow their stories are less valuable. And I would just absolutely refute that idea. And I have to tell you that one of my favorite books that I've ever helped a client create was done by this woman who was she was approaching her 90th birthday, and she typed out her own story on her computer, and she did it in all caps so that she could read it, so the letters were big enough for her to read. And she just started typing things and told the story of her life, and it was just amazing. It was just the most amazing thing. I was literally on my seat as I was designing her book. I couldn't wait to find out what happened next. And she was a housewife from a small town, just telling the stories of her life and her, her romance with her husband. And it was just an absolutely thrilling story. And this woman had, she wasn't famous, she wasn't wealthy, she wasn't, particularly noteworthy, and yet she had these absolutely fascinating stories to tell. So don't be afraid to tell your stories, because there will be someone willing to read them and that will find them interesting. Joan asks, how much are people really willing to read, like number of pages? I think that really depends. I think that one thing that we tell people, or we advise people to do, is to, in the design of their book, is if you put in a lot of pictures and you use a lot of captions with your pictures, and you use visual elements that sort of entice the reader further into the story. Like if you have a picture and you have a caption under the picture that maybe tells a little mini story in itself, or says something funny or something clever or something dramatic, or has a little mystery to it, then it's kind of like when you read a magazine article, they put these big pull quotes in there where they'll take a little snippet out of the text and they'll put it in in bigger type in the middle of the column. Because what it does is it gets you curious about, wait, oh, that's interesting, what's that about? And it draws you into reading the rest of the text because you want to sort of find out what that's about. And you can do that with your own stories as well. As far as a number of pages, I've seen clients who have done books before where they have basically, they have maybe 200 pages of, of text that is it's just the text, and they maybe have put in a picture here and there, and they take it to Kinko's and they photocopy it and put it in a 3-ring binder, and they've given it to their family. And their family has been, oh, thank you so much, Grandma, this is really great. And then they take it and they put it on a shelf, and they sort of put it away as a reference material. And they don't actually sit down and read it through all the way. And yet we can take that same material that's in that book and put it in a more palatable or more interesting format to read, with more visual interest, and maybe a hardbound book so that it will be archival, so that it will last longer than a 3-ring binder. And suddenly people are more interested in being engaged with it, especially younger people. They've grown up with intense visual stimulation from multimedia sources. And that doesn't mean that they won't be willing to read a book, but it just means that the book has to be somewhat visually interesting for them to be able to engage with it, because that's what they're used to engaging with. So as far as a number of pages, generally I think anywhere from 50 to 200 pages is great. and because people can digest that really easily. But I've also, we've had some clients that have done books that are, upward of 700-800 pages. And I would have a hard time sitting down and reading a 700-page book about someone in my family. But I would love to, have it and I would skim it. I would skim through it and sort of read, snippets of it that I found interesting. So that really kind of depends upon you and your family and what you're trying to achieve. But also, again, another good reason to, if you have a lot of information that you want to convey, putting it in smaller doses can ensure that it might be more easily read. If there are any last minute questions, I will address another question. Otherwise, it's 11 o'clock, so we can go ahead and wrap this up. If anyone has any questions for me that they would like to ask after the fact, I'm going to go ahead and type my email address in the little box, so I'm happy to answer any questions in email. And again, if you're interested in purchasing the kit and you want a discount code, you can email me and I will mail that to you. Thank you all for coming today. It's been great, and next week we will be talking about writing your stories, so we hope to see you then. Thank you so much.